Okay, we're going to get started, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Annie Kennedy, and you've seen Ryan all throughout the presentation today. We are going to do an update on what's happening within our advocacy landscape, which is a very broad term here in our Duchenne community. So we're going to cover a lot of territory, and we're going to do it very swiftly in the next 45 minutes. So look at that, there they are. All right, so I'm going to just do a little, maybe a little history about where our community has come from and how we've gotten to today, and the amazing research that we're seeing, the regulatory infrastructure that we have now for product reviews and the access environment, and how this came to be, because it's because of this community and the involvement of our Duchenne community and the families in the community that we're here today. So for those who are newer to the community, we thought this was really important for everyone to understand how you can plug into this and be a part of this. And for those who you may see yourselves in these images, we thought it was important for you to be acknowledged. So in the late 90s, we had a very barren landscape in Washington. There wasn't a lot known about Duchenne in particular, and the federal funding to Duchenne was what we refer to in Washington as budget dust. There just wasn't a lot happening. And so today, the Duchenne community is one of the most empowered, well-known patient communities in Washington. And it took a lot of work to get there. It took a lot of families, and I'm going to just go through a little bit of that. PPMD and this community has played a role in every single victory in the fight to end Duchenne since 1994. And so I think we just need to take a moment and applaud ourselves. So we are the definition of a patient-powered community, and that's a term we now hear a lot within the nation and within the regulatory infrastructure. And that's because as a patient community, we began to convene and bring partners to the table. And so that happened one connection, one congressional member, one partner, one champion at a time. And it really started with this woman who we all know, who one day had a vision for how to build some infrastructure and what pieces were missing, what federal partners needed to come to the table. We needed some surveillance data, we needed some care standards, we needed some new animal models, and she started to meet with people and talk to people. And there was an idea of some draft legislation, but we needed some other champions. So we had families who were starting to groom champions in their local markets, in their local areas. But then we had another family who came onto the scene, and this is Joel Wood, and his son was diagnosed with Duchenne, and Joel and his wife Dana are prominent lobbyists in Washington, and they had very strong connections with members of Congress. And very quickly and very swiftly, those concepts became the draft legislation that we now know as the MD CARE Act. And literally within months of James Wood, Joel's son, being diagnosed with Duchenne, we had a Senate hearing, the first Senate hearing for this Duchenne community. And that became the pivotal moment, the strategic inflection point for this Duchenne community. And we showed up in droves. It is still today known as the largest Senate hearing that's ever been held in Washington. And that day, there was testimony by a lot of experts. There were people from NIH, there were members of our research community. Lee Sweeney testified, and a young man with Duchenne testified that day, and they went off script. And Senator Arlen Specter asked Ben, what's your dream for the future? What do you envision for yourself? And Ben's dad worked for the Department of Defense, and Ben wanted to be a Navy pilot. So he talked about wanting to be a Navy pilot. He talked about wanting to date and get married. And he looked at Senator Specter and he said, I don't know, you spend billions of dollars on military planes. I'm just thinking you could spend a couple $1 million to cure me. And today, we've moved that needle, and that money is now coming into Duchenne. But at that time, it really looked like it was a long way off. The MD CARE Act came into being, was signed into law. Senator Wicker, or then Congressman Wicker, was one of the strongest champions we had at that time, and still today has championed every bill that we as a community have helped to bring into being. And the MD CARE Act has been signed into law not just once, but 3 times. And each time, it's not just because a couple of members decide it's time to update it. It's because we go to those members and say, it's time to update this bill. There are priorities in the community that are now beginning to expire and are updated and are not reflected in the legislation anymore. And we as a community, the people in this room and people who are watching the stream, go to their members and get their members on board to get that bill reauthorized. So I think, again, we need to give ourselves a hand, because that is a very heavy lift and something I think we start to take for granted. And a lot of communities look at us and say, how did you get such landmark legislation that has established this infrastructure? And it's because of everyone in this room and around the country who's really helped to get that done. So give yourselves a hand for that. Okay, so these are the federal agencies who we currently collaborate with. And many of those collaborations started because the MD CARE Act actually instructed those agencies to come to the table and work with us. But we now have really robust, wonderful engagements and partnerships, and many of these agencies are here with us today. They participate in our advocacy conference and come to our policy forums, and we work with them on a daily basis throughout the year. We, every February or March, work on what's known as the appropriations bill, and we craft report language. And that's because the MD CARE Act established a roadmap, if you will. But every year, we have to go back and say, in the annual budget that Congress puts out to the federal agencies, we want to make sure that there are renewed priorities around Duchenne, and that we're going to the federal agencies and helping them understand what the priorities of the Duchenne community are, and that they're working on those priorities as we and our scientific and clinical partners see them. So we are so grateful to the community members who come to Washington with us and help ensure that our congressional champions help get that language into the appropriations bill. And the people who are not able to travel to Washington but reach out to your members and respond to the action alerts. We learned this morning that the labor HHS bill included all of the report language that we drove this year. So again, a big round of applause. Okay, so these relationships, though, aren't just about going to Washington, one point in time visits. There are families who have really groomed these relationships for years, for decades, who visit the congressional members in their home districts, who know them by name, who know their family members, who invite them to your events back at home. And that makes all of the difference. And so these are just some examples of families who have really extraordinary, lasting relationships with members of Congress and members who've really helped us move the needle. And our goal isn't just that when we drive a Duchenne-specific bill that we get members to sign on, or when we have report language that we have members sign on. Our goal is that we have members of Congress who care so much and so personally about our Duchenne community that every policy and every issue that comes across their desk is viewed through the lens of Duchenne. We want them to look at any issue that's being considered and pick up the phone and call us, or pick up the phone and call you, or email you and say, how does this impact your family? And we've had meetings. There's a picture here of Senator Collins with Matthew and Patrick Denger and Brian. And we've had meetings with Senator Collins and her staff. And her staff just sat down and said, okay, all your talking points are all fine and good. That's great. But how does this impact the Denger boys? And that's a win. That means that Senator Collins and her staff understands that the priorities of the Duchenne community are what need to be considered, and she just wants to understand through the lens of a specific family why this bill matters. Okay, some of these relationships that are formed locally don't stay local, and so there are a number of families who've developed really wonderful local relationships, and then those members move, and they get elected into other positions. And the issues, whether they're Duchenne-specific issues or not, really raise a level of awareness on Duchenne to extraordinarily high places. And so we have that young man, Ben Cumbo, who I mentioned earlier, worked in Senator Obama's Senate office, and then later in the White House with President Obama. We have an image here of Colin Wrench, who went to a few meetings with Fred Upton, who led the charge on 21st century cures and integrated Duchenne into all of his talking points around 21st century cures, and ultimately there were a lot of gains for us in that. There's a picture of Dusty here. Is Kath in the room right now? Dusty, who spent time in the White House, and this was a part of, I believe it was his Make-A-Wish trip. He went to the White House and spent time with the previous administration, got to know them. Again, the administration understanding Duchenne, getting to know our community. And then Jordan McLinn, who has an extraordinary relationship with Mike Pence and has really done great things to, again, raise the flag on priorities for the Duchenne community. This is another example of a family who met Senator Blumenthal. I don't know if Chris and Jess are in the audience right now. Met them on an outreach during one of our Hill visits. And Senator Blumenthal has become an amazing friend of their family. And this was a sample of a tweet that he sent out during the Graham-Cassidy bill. This is when, a year ago, there were a lot of bills being introduced around Medicaid. And he kept in touch with their family to understand how the Medicaid provisions that were being introduced could potentially impact the Duchenne community. And he stood on the floor of the Senate that day with an image of Connor behind him and talked about Connor specifically, and then continued to push out social media about why he was representing the cause specifically on behalf of the Duchenne community. So another great example about an issue that we didn't take necessarily to Washington, but members who were really starting to understand why issues matter to us and how they impact us. So what have we done with this? Well, we've really looked at our landscape, and we've looked at the research pipeline, and we've said there are a lot of opportunities here, and we have a lot of therapies coming through the pipeline. And in 2012, there was a very large legislative package being reauthorized called the Food and Drug Safety Innovation Act. And within it, there was a Prescription Drug User Fee Act. And we worked with a lot of our partners to ensure that patient experience data and patient communities like ours could be in the center of the interactions with industry as products were moving through the pipeline, meaning that we would no longer be considered just the end user after a product was approved, but we and the evidence that we could generate, the experiences that we were having within clinical trials, our preferences about therapies that were being developed would be integrated as central within the drug development pipeline. And so PDUFA 5, which is that acronym, came into being with a lot of input from us and our community. And then we took that language within PDUFA 5 and utilized it as a roadmap. And we became innovators within that and did a lot of work under PDUFA 5. And there's a list of some of the patient-focused drug development work that we've led under PDUFA 5. And I'm going to keep going, but I think some of you have heard us talk about this before, have been involved in it. The other thing that happened shortly after that is an effort happened in Washington called 21st Century Cures. So this was congressionally driven to look at what are the inefficiencies in academics and drug development that were delaying the time between good ideas getting from the bench to therapies to patients. And this was a process that took about 2 years. It included congressional hearings, it included roundtables in communities, it included groups like ours driving individual legislation to become provisions within that package. And at every level, PPMD and our community were involved. So Pat testified in one of the first congressional hearings. There were roundtables all throughout the country, and we had members of our community who testified in those various roundtables. We held 4 congressional briefings around, or congressional briefings around concepts that we were moving forward. We were invited to one that was being held on transitions, specifically on how drug development was or was not benefiting those who were non-ambulatory, and there's Buddy Cassidy there with Roger Daltrey, who also was a part of that. And ultimately, it was passed into law. But within that, we also introduced a bill called the Patient-Focused Impact Assessment Act. We wanted to ensure that all of the data that our patient community was generating was regarded as data at the FDA during regulatory review, and that we had a feedback loop to understand how FDA was or was not using that as products were being reviewed at the FDA. We wanted a report card, if you will, when products move through the FDA. So we introduced that during our actual annual conference in June of 2015. That was passed in the Senate and ultimately was a part of the 21st Century Cures Act and became a key provision and a part of the patient-focused drug development provision within 21st Century Cures. And we're now beginning to see the guidances come out of FDA that reflect that law that we drove. The day that 21st Century Cures was signed into law, we happened to be at a listening session with Commissioner Califf. And Janet Woodcock was very excited about 21st Century Cures being signed into law. They were getting ready to go over to the White House. They were super excited about this. And she was reflecting on the fact that when PDUFA 5 had been signed into law 5 years previously, it was just a concept. They didn't really know if it would take off. They didn't really know what would happen with it. But that patient communities had really run with it and had gone so much further with it than they'd ever imagined they would. And when 21st Century Cures would be signed into law later that day, 21st Century Cures would codify patient-focused drug development as a part of the FDA's mission for the very first time. And that really sent chills down my spine, because that meant that we as a community had taken these concepts that had sort of just been tossed out there and turned them into such critical constructs that FDA now had implemented them as a part of their mission. So they weren't just engaging with us because it seemed like a good thing to do, a nice thing to do. They were now required to do it. So, and we're now seeing this reflected at every turn in our engagements with FDA. So the PPMD community has led the passage of 5 congressional bills. So we just need to take a moment and applaud ourselves, because this is extraordinary. All right, but we still have a lot to do. So before we even got to the first approvals in Duchenne, this is a list of some of the capacities, we like to refer to them, some of the tools that we as a community had created and built. And so we had an incredibly engaged patient community. We had published standards of care. We had a well-characterized disease. We had funded and established natural history studies. We had community-specific patient preference data, biomarkers. We as a community had developed guidance for industry, and FDA had published their guidance back. We had validated screening tests, developed outcome measures, collaborative pharmaceutical industry, a very collaborative pharmaceutical industry, an international patient registry, federal agency engagement, a national surveillance program in epidemiology, and a certified Duchenne care center network. And we were working in an anticipatory way towards the access environment. And ultimately, it's all about access to improved effective therapies. FDA issued their final guidance, and it was pretty record time for FDA. We were cautiously optimistic that we were in pretty good shape going towards approvals. We knew that it wasn't going to be a slam dunk towards access. We knew that rare disease was hard, but we had done a lot of work. Our drug development roundtable was doing work to understand not just what the FDA wanted now that the guidance had been published, but what we could learn from the interactions that individual drug companies were having with the FDA and how we could do better. Kathy had convened care meetings around the burden of clinical trials for the patient community, how we could improve on the processes, how we could streamline trials so we could get them up and going faster, how things could be more unified across trials. We are really working to cover these bases. Ryan and I have been working on the access and coverage resources, so building resources for clinicians and patient communities so you can navigate how to find and navigate access. These are very disjointed systems, as we know, and you hit a lot of speed bumps at every turn. But we really had been working, many of you participated in the policy forum we had 2 years ago, with a lot of policy experts who were helping to advise us and get us ready. And Pat showed this the other day. We really thought, okay, we were prepped, we were ready, we were getting there. And I borrowed this slide from Conrad Reynoldson, who used it in our transitions meeting yesterday. And he used it as an example of how accessibility can fail in the public, but I think it's a great image of how access can sometimes fail in therapy access and DME access. And so we had really great ramps. We thought we had some nice curb cuts, but we certainly have hit some hurdles. And they were unanticipated hurdles. And if you look really closely at this image, and one of the reasons I love this image is that even if you somehow miraculously got over the center, you're going to hit a pole on the other side. And I'm sure that that's sometimes how it feels, that you get through an appeal process, you maybe get through a determination, and then there's a redetermination 6 months later, and you find yourself having to cross back through traffic over the street. We have to do better. So FDA had a framework called the Patient-Focused Drug Development Meetings and Workshops. This was established under PDUFA. And they had been conducting these meetings to really inform drug development, clinical trials, and the way they look at the drug review process. These were really effective meetings, and what FDA was doing was conducting these meetings with individual disease groups and then publishing a Voice of the Patient report. We really hadn't considered doing a meeting like that with FDA because we had had our policy forum in 2013 and done this whole body of work since that time, and had actually even talked to FDA about it, and they had agreed that they thought we were probably past the point of needing a specific PFDD meeting workshop. But what we decided we wanted to do was take the format for the PFDD workshop, which was a really great format, take the questions that had been developed for the PFDD workshops, and expand them to bring in all of the federal agency partners and stakeholders who we've been working with, to start to look at all of the questions across the access environment, the approval environment, where the barriers have been to diagnosis, care, to bring everybody to the table. We have burden of disease studies out there, but they're clearly not informing policy determinations and the valuations that we need. We needed to do a deeper dive and start to look under some other rocks. So we went to FDA and asked, can we use your framework and build it out? And they said absolutely, they'd be happy for us to do that. So in March, we held our Compass meeting, is what we called it. It was sort of a patient-focused drug development 2.0 workshop. So the goals were to identify current policy, care, and clinical trial priorities among our Duchenne community members by subpopulation, to renew our engagements with our existing federal and industry partners, and to begin to identify measures of impact not currently captured in health economic models or value frameworks. All of our federal partners were invited. We established a community advisory board to inform and guide our meeting. We published a white paper in advance of the meeting to set the context for why we were doing this meeting and what our community had done previously. And the meeting was live streamed just like this one today, and we did live polling throughout the meeting so that community members who weren't physically with us that day could also participate and be represented in the data that we were collecting. So this was our community advisory board, and we are so grateful to the partners in the community who came together with us to put this meeting together. As we had drafts of the white paper and questions and things going into the meeting, the feedback really strengthened and informed what we were doing, and actually even strengthened and informed some of the content for this meeting here today. And the same for the report that is actually being published today. So we're really excited. These are the first results that we're sharing with you here today. And then we'll be pushing them out online, and all of the raw data from that report, all the polling results, will be available on PPMD's website. So the panels that we had represented community, our subpopulations, as we refer to them, are individual communities across the journey in Duchenne. We had more than 400 members of our community there that day, and members of our community were considered participants in the discussion, not the audience. The audience were the federal agency partners and the pharmaceutical industry partners. That's who was there to listen. We were all there to discuss and share and contribute to the data. So the first panel was the Duchenne, the Early Journey in Elementary Years panel, and the themes that came out of that panel and were addressed at the panel were emerging symptoms in the diagnostic odyssey, seeking care and making treatment decisions, clinical trial participation, and accommodating Duchenne and family life. The second panel that day was transition time, the tween and teen years. The themes were emotional, that it was a very emotional time in the Duchenne journey, the physical features of this transition phase, the rapidly expanding areas of care and the care needs, access barriers, narrowing clinical trial options. That was a really strong theme there. Social and educational needs, which it's ironic that there's a typo in educational, access and advocacy, and future aspirations. Panel 3, reflecting on Duchenne's impact to the family unit. This was a very powerful panel, and if you haven't watched the webcast, we encourage that you do, or read the report. This was, the themes here were really looking at the collateral costs of Duchenne, marital strains, loss of family privacy, the impacted health of other family members outside of the individual diagnosed with Duchenne, impacts on siblings, and joys between sorrows. This was a really beautiful panel, and we really applaud the people who participated in it. And then panel 4 was our adult panel, and this was looking at Duchenne through our adult lens. And there were a lot of issues highlighted on this panel, and again, we encourage you to go to the report and look at this. And they talked about life after high school, the unfailing support of their families really rose to the top of the discussion. Adaptation and resilience, symptom impacts, and the evolving trade-offs for benefits and risks of therapies and activities, clinical trials and compassionate use, the need for non-ambulatory outcome measures, access barriers, eligibility for transplant as your heart becomes more compromised, mental health care, pain control, and family planning. Okay, so we have a lot of data, and I know we're short on time, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But Ryan did this question earlier and polled people around research participation. So we did that question at this meeting. And one of the reasons why we are doing additional polling today is that we learned a lot in that polling in March, and we wanted to do a deeper dive into the polling. And what we are doing, and what you will see in the report, is that we're pulling this polling that we've been doing in March and today together with what we've learned through the patient preference studies, what we know from the burden of disease studies that have been conducted in Duchenne, what we have in the Duchenne registry and MD StarNet, and we're bringing all of this data together, and then we're taking this to our federal agency partners, we're taking these into our conversations with payers, we're bringing this to our industry partners, and we're looking at how we can use this to inform decisions around access, to inform what we're doing in our protocols and in our clinical trials, and this data is very powerful. And we also want to see that in burden of disease, and this is the way we measure how much it costs to have an individual with Duchenne living in your family, to be someone living with Duchenne, we feel like we're significantly undervaluing that, and we're missing things when we look at that. And we're really trying to capture other metrics, other measures that we should be capturing when we look at these costs. And so you'll see in the questions we're going to do in just a minute that we're really trying to elicit what are some other metrics that we could be looking at across the data systems that we now have. And with this new ICD-10 code, we're going to have the ability to work with Social Security and some other partners to look at some additional data. And so what else should we be considering? What else is of value and impacting your family's regular expenses in Duchenne? So all of this is in the report, so you'll find it all online. So I'm going to actually skip through it. But we asked people to rank priorities for what measures of health you would want to preserve, what measures of strength would be priorities. We asked about ramifications of denials and delays related to durable medical equipment, and really critical themes emerged relative to this. And this was a particular interest to our partners at CMS who participated in the meeting. And there were a lot of conversations around, what's happening as you're working through a denial for a power wheelchair, what's actually happening to your physical health in the meantime. It's not just frustrating, but there are actually pulmonary and spinal ramifications, and that really impacted the conversations that we can now have with CMS. I'm just going to end with 3 quotes that came from the meeting. The first is, 3 formerly complete strangers now have keys to our home, our son's caregivers. The respite time is nice for my wife, and these state-paid helping hands relieve us of the stuff that sometimes grinds your attitude, bathing, toiling, etc. I've been around this community long enough to know things aren't going to get easier. I consider these 3 people gifts to our family, but they're so difficult to find, and they're so difficult to secure with a solid schedule. Another theme, and that was a theme that kept coming up, another theme that came up a lot was Duchenne truly impacts every single aspect of our family's lives. The houses we live in, the cars we drive, the way we participate in activities, the activities we choose to participate in. It impacts every single thing with one exception, how much we deeply love our boys. And then the last quote I'll end on is, I'm doing my best to manage the effects of Duchenne currently, but keeping stable and even getting a bit of strength from a new drug would mean a lot of living with a degenerative disease. So I would just like to end by asking anyone in the room who served on a panel or was a part of the community advisory board to stand or raise your hand or honk your horn if you're one of our young adults. Could you do that so we could acknowledge you? Because this was a mammoth effort and a lot of people here participated. I see Colin back there. Colleen, stand up. Don't be shy. Okay, Lance, stand up. Brian. All right, thank you guys. So the report's going online. Ryan's now going to do some additional polling. And I think that was my last slide. Yep. Sorry, I'll scroll that forward while you do. Okay, Ryan's going to do some additional polling.
Okay, let me make sure I don't lose my place here. Annie's going to provide really some context around some of these questions that we are going to pose to you all, and these are going to be specific to our families in the audience. As Annie mentioned before, quite often the full calculation of the burden of disease on an individual or a family unit is really not calculated properly. I think we think and believe and see that it leaves out a number of variables. And we began some of the polling at the Compass meeting and dove into this, and we felt that this meeting gave us an opportunity to take a bit of a deeper dive into that, to continue that conversation. And Annie, I don't know if you have anything to add to that before we get started with the first question. And you can get the first polling question up too. It's not a hot mic.
I can really talk loud. Oh, there you go. Are the slides coming up? Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we're asking that one family member answer on behalf of the family so that we aren't confounding the data with multiple family members representing one answer. You can choose all that apply here. I'm not going to read them.
Just so when you go to the report, that's also what we did at the Compass meeting. So when you see the data from the Compass meeting, that's representative of each family who participated in that meeting.
Again, these are often things that aren't measured properly when it comes to understanding the full impact and burden and cost associated with Duchenne. Give it another 20 seconds. Okay. Still coming in.
Yeah.
It's always hard to tell when I should say next question, but I want to get as much data as possible. Okay, looks like it's slowed down a bit, and there's a equal distribution among 3 of these. And we're going to post these results afterwards so everyone can make sure to review them and digest them again following the conference. Okay, so we can move on to the next polling question. For this one, we want to understand how far do you currently travel for semi or annual comprehensive Duchenne Becker care, and choose one in this case and one family member representing that family unit. And we're thinking in terms of door-to-door here. I know that many of you fly, many of you drive. Whatever the way you travel, we want to understand in amounts of hours here. A high percentage of more than 10 hours, indicating that those care centers are often outside of their state or in their general area, obviously. Okay, that looks like that slowed down a bit. Annie, I don't know if you had...
Yep, I think you can go to the next one.
Okay. We can move on to the next polling question. Okay, I'm going to read these ones. This is for families and one per family in these questions. Which of the following items have you paid for yourself as an out-of-pocket expense to enable mobility outside of your house? And you can choose all that apply. Accessible van, and then an accessible van with modifications to enable wheelchair entry. Then a accessible van with modifications for a driver using a wheelchair, modified hand controls for the driver, rehabilitation assessment for driver with Duchenne or Becker, driver education classes for the driver, or none of the above.
And remember, this is a choose all that apply. So if over time you've done multiple things, keep selecting.
And that high percentage of the none of the above would probably factor into where the family is in their journey and the age of their son. So it looks like that slowed down. Okay, can move on to the next question. Okay. One per family again. Which of the following items have you paid for yourself out of pocket to make your home more accessible? Choose all that apply. And I'm not going to read these out loud.
And so what we're trying to get here is that these are items that are often not fully reimbursed or reimbursed. And we're trying to, again, elicit measures that we could be building into health economic models. This data is also used when patient assistant programs are coming into the community. So a lot of those programs that a lot of our industry partners work with, they come to us and ask for information like this. So what are some of the things that we could be doing and building into our programs to help support the community if we have funds and resources to do that? So this is the kind of information that we could share with them as they're looking to prioritize resources.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I believe this is the last question of the data set. This is for healthcare professionals and families. We want you to tell us one area, and actually we changed this to which two areas, so ignore that one part, of national or state policy area that you believe needs major change or attention. So choose two that you think need the most change or attention.
And we know this is a hard list to just choose two because there are a lot of these systems need a lot of support and help. So these are all on our list of areas to be working in. We're just very interested in how the community prioritizes these as we look to tackle them.
So we see that Medicaid waiver process high up there on the lower drug pricing issue, which I'm sure some of you have seen on social media, strong opinions about. Access to approved therapies, especially with this new landscape, is close behind. And it is hard to choose two, but okay. I think that is the last polling question, unless I'm wrong, John? Okay, great. So thank you so much. We're going to continue our polling tomorrow. throughout the day. In between sessions, you'll notice they are indicated, of course, on your agenda for when we're going to be doing that polling. So I'm going to switch gears just a bit as the final part of this presentation to give you an update on our BRAVE program. This is our patient preference research program that began following the passage of the Food and Drug Safety and Innovation Act, where FDA launched PFDD. I'm sure you're all sick of acronyms by now and your head is swimming with them, but Washington really loves those acronyms. So really following the passage of that bill and the new provisions that came out of it, PPMD began to look at innovative and new ways of collecting data around patient preferences, patient perspectives in a rigorous scientific way to produce hard data for drug developers as well as regulators about how you all think and feel about these emerging therapies. And with the passage of that bill, we looked at this as an opportunity to really innovate. And we were among the first rare disease communities to, if not the first, to launch into patient preference research. We saw some examples in the obesity community, and we thought this is something we can do to really gain insight from a broad array of stakeholders within, caregivers and patients within our community about their preferences for these emerging treatments. So, what is patient preference information? This is data that is systematically collected from patients and caregivers in order to understand how they think and feel about things like disease burden, meaningful benefit, and acceptable risk of these emerging therapies. It's a way for us to quantify the patient voice. And, there's complexities and challenges with translating individual viewpoints into more general assumptions about a patient community. And patient preference research allows us to survey a broader population of the community, patients and caregivers, and to get really a more representative sample of those viewpoints. Now, historically, the FDA has really relied on the advisory committee at the end of the drug review process in order to obtain this sort of patient preference information. And while this is a very powerful process, we believe strongly in it. We participate in it and work with patients on being prepared for these advisory committee meetings. And their stories are really important to helping the FDA understand about what they care about with these emerging therapies. They fail to provide us with quantitative evidence for the FDA about things like meaningful benefit and acceptable risk. And they also come at the end of that process of drug development. And patient preference studies allow us to inform the full arc of drug development in Duchenne and inform an array of stakeholders from regulators, the drug companies, researchers, healthcare professionals, the payer community, which this is an evolving area where Annie and I see use of patient preference information. There's been only a few examples, but we're pushing for the inclusion of this data within payer determinations. And then, of course, ourselves, so we can better communicate out to those developing therapies and reviewing therapies about what we care about. So this is how we do these studies. We use what's called stated preference methods, and these are methods for collecting and analyzing data about what people think and feel. And they're surveys that provide us with numbers about how important good things are in comparison to the bad things, or how much bad were people willing to accept for the good, in this case, benefits and risks. So with gene therapy as an emerging technology and an area of great interest, lots of uncertainty, lots of hope, this is really a rich area to collect data from the patient community about their preferences, their perceptions on gene therapy, how they feel about the uncertainty around it, and what they think about the potential benefits and risks of this emerging technology. So we were actually approached by Pfizer and Solid Biosciences about a year and a half ago, I want to say. And they asked us, is there something we can do to engage the community around gene therapy so that we can be better prepared for our trials, for informed consent, and to better get a handle on what we need to do to develop tools around education for the community with gene therapy. So we were happy to do this, and we formed a kind of a three-pronged approach to do a set of qualitative interviews, which some of you participated in about a year ago, and then that would inform the stated preference survey, the more quantitative part of our project, and this is all about the ongoing educational initiative that's been underway since really the start of all this. The PPMD has been putting things out via webinars, via blogs, and information sheets over time. This is a collaboration with RTI International. They're a group out of North Carolina, and our contact is Holly PA. She worked for PPMD for a number of years, and she's a social scientist. We formed a stakeholder advisory board that consisted of members of Pfizer and of Solid, as well as a patient representative, a caregiver, a physician, and members of those companies, and a social scientist, and then the PPMD team. And our goal was to explore these preferences and risk tolerance around gene therapy as well as clinical trial decision-making. And I'm going to report on some of the results for the first time specific to the clinical trial decision-making piece. So the qualitative study. So for those who don't know, qualitative studies really, this is a way you can engage a patient community and do a series of interviews or do open comment surveys where you ask them a few questions, and then you take that data and you analyze it. You do what's called a thematic analysis to draw some conclusions. And the point of this was to then take that information and form a more quantitative survey for the community so we can collect that stated preference data. So the qualitative part included 17 parents, 6 adults with Duchenne. We used these semi-structured interviews. They were recorded and transcribed and then analyzed, as I said, using that thematic analysis. And the way that worked is we presented this vignette or this story of sorts to the people we were interviewing. And we talked to the research community, and we ensured that we had the most accurate information. And this was about a year ago when we did this process, so things have happened since then, but just to give you that context. In terms of the anticipated benefits, we talked about the variable benefit based on initiation, that younger patients may benefit more, and that there could be impact on skeletal, breathing, and heart function from gene therapy. Talked about the mode of administration, one-time IV administration. Talked about the caveats with gene therapy, that the duration based on animal studies could be 8 to 10 years, but there's insufficient evidence to know exactly how long it would last. So this is this level of uncertainty with gene therapy that we had to frame for those people we were interviewing. And that this could cause an inability to participate in other clinical trials due to participating in this study. And then we talked about risks, that the main concern was a risk of a huge immune response soon after gene therapy. And then we did some hypothetical risks to probe some questions about how they think and feel about these potential risks. Risk of death first described in 1 in 100, and then described 1 in 100,000, just to see, if you had that potential for a risk, what would you do in your decision-making to participate in a clinical trial, and how would you feel with how we framed all of these attributes, the benefits, the mode, the caveats. So what we learned was, in terms of the benefits, of course, people really valued the potential benefits with gene therapy to all systems, both muscle, cardiac, and pulmonary, and that There was greater importance for those at a later stage, of course, for cardiac and pulmonary. These are things we've seen in all our studies. In terms of the risks, we found that more than half of our respondents, and this was a small sample set, were willing to take on a 1% risk of death with evidence of increased risk tolerance as the patient or caregiver dealt with more progression at later stages. And in the limitations and the caveats, we found that most were concerned, of course, with these limitations, the one-time dosing, losing the eligibility for other trials, but they were optimistic that we would eventually progress past these and scientific advances would get us through them. Interestingly enough, many described this desire for possibly waiting for the right time to do gene therapy, whether that was early on when their child was younger, whether it was the young adult we were talking to before they were going to lose a critical activity of daily living. So because it was a one-time thing, they felt maybe there was an appropriate time, in their opinion, to actually administer this. So we found these results to be interesting, and we did form a study around this, and I'm going to talk about one piece of the study. I don't have time to go over the full study, but in late July, we're going to present all these results via a webinar for those who are interested. But for now, I'm going to go through one piece, which is study aim 1 and 2. So we wanted to explore what participants cared most and least about when deciding whether or not to join a gene therapy study. And if you recall, it was Solid and Pfizer approached us about doing this study, and this is, of course, something they'd be very interested in. And we talked about how we could administer this part of the study and how to structure it. And we had a great interaction with them and the rest of our advisory board, one of which is here, and now Colin is here. In AIM 2, after doing AIM 1, it's all well and good if we learn how much they care about these attributes, but are they even interested in participating? So we followed up with some questions about would they be interested in at least screening for a gene therapy study. Participants, criteria, adults with Duchenne, and then Duchenne parents and guardians. How am I on time, by the way? Probably way over. I always do this. We use a methodology called best-worst scaling, which I'll talk about in a minute. We then presented them with the story, because we knew not everybody would understand where we currently are, what are the knowns and unknowns around gene therapy prior to them getting in. We did a whiteboard video. It was a 2-minute video that gave them an overview of the current landscape and what we know about gene therapy. And here's just a bit about the story. We expect gene therapy to help people's muscles, lungs, and hearts to work better for a longer amount of time. This is not a cure. That was important to make clear. Very young children would probably benefit most, but it would probably help most people with Duchenne. You'd only be able to use it possibly one time. We just don't know yet if you can redose. And then based on animal studies, the benefits could last for 10 years, but no one knows how long yet those benefits will last. So here's the setup for the experiment and what they saw when they took the survey. They're asked to imagine you are, or your child, depending on if it was adult or a caregiver taking the survey, invited into an early phase clinical trial to determine whether gene therapy works, test the safety, and figure out how large of a dose to give. And then we presented them with a list of things that may be important if you're deciding to join, whether to enroll in a trial, and we're going to ask them what they care about the most and the least. And then we remind them that we're talking about data from animal studies when we mention data in the specific attributes that we list for them. And that collecting data at the end of the day is the goal in the human clinical trials. So then we provided them with this list of attributes to review prior to taking the survey. And the list of attributes spanned benefit, the limitations, and the risks. So it's similar to what we did in the qualitative study. For the benefits, we said there's a chance for improved muscle function, chance of improved heart function, chance of improved lung function. For the limitations, The benefits could only last 10 years or less. Trial uses placebo group. Lowest dose may be too low for benefit. Not eligible for future clinical trials. No later use of gene therapies or gene editing if you participated in the study. And all of these attributes also had a definition associated with them. So these are just the labels of those attributes, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And then under the risks, 2 muscle biopsies if you participated, chance of a long hospitalization, and then we did a low chance of death as an attribute. What? We're getting long. What? Okay, we have to wrap. Okay, so here's just what the experiment looked like. This is an example of what they saw when they took the survey. They had the list of attributes, and they were asked, what do you care most about, and what do you care least about? And they had to choose one on each side, and then they had 11 lists that were flipped and shuffled 11 times, so they took this over and over again. And here are the results of the experiment. We see that what they cared most about was that chance of improved muscle function. And this is across 243 caregivers and 34 adults. Chance of improved heart function was followed by that, and lung function. What you're seeing here is, of course, the possibility of benefit certainly outweighed the risks in their decision making. So what they cared about least was placebo group, muscle biopsies, chance of long hospitalization. And what we found interesting is that the later use of gene therapies or CRISPR was so high on that list. So that's kind of that future-oriented therapeutic optimism, even with CRISPR, which is a little far off now from development. When we then broke it down by specific subgroups, like adults or parents of non-ambulatory children, or those who are caregivers or parents of ambulatory children, the only difference we found in priorities was the lung benefit. So the adults prioritized the lung benefit much higher than that of the parents of non-ambulatory children and those who are ambulatory. I know I'm trying to skip through this. Then when we asked about, are you even interested in joining a clinical trial? We had 2 scenarios. One was if it was a 3-hour information session, screening visit, and you had a blood draw and a physical exam, how likely would you be? Very, somewhat, not very, not at all. And then we added some burden. 8-hour drive, 2 nights, so you can attend a full day. Then you would have the physical exam, muscle function testing, blood draw, but expenses covered. Here are the results. We found that in scenario 1, the 3-hour screening visit, that the vast majority were very likely and very interested in joining a gene therapy study. And then when you add a little more burden, the adults were a little less likely to join, but most were either somewhat or very likely to join. So even with that additional burden, there was great interest in screening and joining a gene therapy study. Okay, so we learned the possible benefits drive decision-making more than the risks, that while the benefits are important motivators, we do see concern about later access to therapies like CRISPR. And these procedures and protocols that we found, biopsies and chance of placebo, which in prior studies people were very concerned about. You saw that in our data earlier today. But when presented with this specific story and when it's associated with gene therapy, those were much lower on that priority list, which we found interesting. And then people were very interested in doing these trials. So should I stop there, or are we way over? I want to thank the advisory board and the funders of this study. We couldn't have done it without them, and their engagement throughout the process was incredible. So with that, should I stop, Annie?
We're getting the hook from the back of the room.
Oh, I've been ignoring the back of the room. Who's giving me the hook?
I say talk about advocacy all day.
The hook? Okay. Okay, Kim's giving the hook. What time is it, by the way? Is that you calling me? Because my pocket keeps vibrating. And as much as I've been enjoying it, has that been you trying to contact me? So, anyway. We do have an upcoming study that I want people to participate in. I just want to give a quick plug. It'll take 2 seconds, I promise. It's a global preference study that's in collaboration with 6 patient groups, which is pretty incredible. And this is the first time we're doing an international preference study. So please be on the lookout for it. It's supported by Pfizer and EveryLife, and I will shut up now. Thank you.